The stage lights had already gone out when he said it. Not during the applause. Not in the middle of a soaring chorus. It was after everything. After the last note dissolved into the dark. After the crowd's voices thinned into the night air. Backstage, in a room that smelled faintly of sweat and old wood, Samthing Soweto sat with his hands folded loosely in his lap. No grand announcement. No dramatic reveal. Just a pause that stretched a little longer than usual, as if he were measuring whether the silence he had guarded for so long could finally be broken without shattering something fragile. For years, he had done what he does best. He sang. He sang about longing that felt too heavy for words, about tenderness that sneaks up on you, about heartbreak that doesn't leave with the sunrise. His voice carried other people's love stories, held them gently, turned them into something that felt almost sacred. But when it came to his own heart, he built walls so carefully you could mistake them for part of the architecture. Interviews would drift toward the personal, and he would smile, tilt his head slightly, redirect the conversation back to the music. Fans speculated. Comment sections bloomed with theories. He let them. He never corrected, never confirmed. There was a time when that silence felt protective, necessary even. The public can be kind, but it can also be merciless. And he had learned, sometimes the hard way, that once you let the world into your private joy, it starts asking for proof. Proof that it's real. Proof that it will last. Proof that you deserve it. So he kept his love life in the shadows, even as his songs climbed charts, and his name echoed across venues from Johannesburg to Cape Town. He was known for the vulnerability in his lyrics, the way he could make a room full of strangers feel like they were the only two people left in the world. Yet the man behind the microphone remained, deliberately, just out of reach. Then came the post. Not flashy, not accompanied by a photo shoot or a coordinated rollout. Just a single image, blurred at the edges, warm with late afternoon light. 2 cups of coffee on a small wooden table. A hand, not his, resting near the rim. The caption was simple, almost careless. Some things are worth protecting. Some are worth sharing. No names, no tags, but it was enough. Within minutes, the internet did what it does best. Zoomed in, speculated, dissected every pixel. Whose hand was that? Where was the photo taken? Was this the confirmation everyone had been waiting for? He didn't respond immediately. He never does. Instead, a week later, in a radio interview that was meant to promote a new single, he surprised the host. The conversation had drifted toward inspiration. Where do the songs come from now? Are they still born from solitude? He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and for a second, the studio felt too quiet. "I'm not writing from the same place anymore," he said. "I'm writing from somewhere fuller." The word hung there. Fuller. Not louder. Not happier in the obvious, glossy way. Just fuller. It wasn't a confession in the dramatic sense. There were no sweeping declarations, no rehearsed lines about destiny. In fact, he seemed almost reluctant, as if each word had to be tested before it left his mouth. He spoke about fear first, the fear of opening up again, of trusting that what feels right today won't unravel tomorrow. He admitted that after certain disappointments, you start convincing yourself that loving quietly is safer than loving boldly. And then he stopped, smiled in a way that looked less like performance and more like surrender. "She didn't ask to be in the spotlight," he said softly. "That's probably why I knew she was different." It was the first time he used the word she so clearly, so intentionally. No metaphors, no hiding behind poetic ambiguity, just she. The studio host blinked, momentarily unsure whether to push further, but he continued on his own. He talked about meeting someone who didn't treat his fame as currency. Someone who listened to him speak without interrupting, who challenged him without trying to control him. Someone who understood that the man who sings about love isn't always confident in it. Those close to him had noticed the change long before the public did. Friends described a new lightness, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. Not the restless energy of infatuation, but something quieter. He was showing up differently, to rehearsals, to family gatherings, even to himself. There were fewer late-night disappearances into the studio, fueled by unresolved emotions. The music was still deep, still aching in places, but it no longer felt like it was trying to patch up a wound. And yet, he refused to turn his relationship into a spectacle. No red carpet debut, no carefully staged couple photos. When asked directly if he was in love, he didn't laugh it off this time. He didn't dodge. He simply nodded once, slowly. "I am," he said, "but I'm learning not to rush what's real." For a man whose career has been built on emotional transparency, this might be his most surprising move. Not the fact that he's found love again, but that he's choosing to reveal it on his own terms. Not as gossip, not as a headline crafted by someone else, as a quiet truth, spoken without theatrics. Fans who have followed him since the early days remember the guarded version of him. The artist who would rather pour everything into a song than risk saying it plainly. Now, there's something undeniably different. He still protects what matters. He still draws boundaries. But there's a subtle shift, a willingness to let people see that behind the voice that carried their heartbreaks is a man who dared to believe in love again. And maybe that's the part that feels almost shocking. Not that he has someone new, not that he's smiling more often, but that after years of singing about devotion, loss, hope, and fragile promises, he finally allowed himself to step out from behind the metaphor and admit that this time the love he's describing isn't borrowed from imagination. It's his. And for the first time, he's not just writing about it. He's living it. Before this new chapter, before the softened smile, before the careful admission, there was another version of him. Quieter, yes, but not calm. Not at peace. There were rumors. There are always rumors when you are loved by millions and understood by almost no one. Whispers about who he was seeing, about who left whom, about whether the heartbreak in his music was art or autobiography. People spoke with certainty about moments they had never witnessed. They built timelines from photos, constructed narratives from lyrics, turned his silences into confessions he never made. He watched it all from a distance. In the early years of his rise, when his songs began to climb charts and his name carried weight in rooms he once could not enter, the noise grew louder. Fame has a way of arriving with open arms and hidden hooks. The more visible he became, the less space he seemed to have for himself. Every collaboration was analyzed. Every female voice near his own was scrutinized. A shared stage became a secret romance. A friendly photo became evidence. At first, he tried to laugh it off. Then he tried to ignore it. Eventually, he stopped trying at all. There was a stretch. Those close to him remember it well, when he pulled back. Fewer interviews, fewer public appearances that weren't strictly about the music. He canceled appearances that felt unnecessary. He declined conversations that drifted too easily toward the personal. Some called it arrogance. Others called it burnout. The truth was less dramatic, more human. He was tired. Tired of defending things that were never fully his to begin with. Tired of watching strangers debate the state of his heart as if it were a trending topic. Tired of the way vulnerability, once admired in his art, became something people felt entitled to in his private life. There were nights when he chose the studio over explanations, when a melody felt safer than a statement. Instead of addressing speculation, he wrote. Instead of correcting headlines, he layered harmonies until the outside world blurred into background noise. Music became not just his profession, but his shield. He understood something many artists learn too late. The more famous you become, the more fiercely you crave a corner of life untouched by applause. Fame expands your world and shrinks it at the same time. You gain reach, but you lose anonymity. You gain admiration, but you lose the freedom to make mistakes quietly. And he wanted quiet, not the kind of silence that feels like absence, the kind that feels like ownership. A space where he could be unsure, imperfect, unobserved. A space where love, if it ever came again, could grow without commentary. There were wounds during that time, not always visible, not always dramatic, but real. Relationships that faltered under scrutiny. Conversations that ended because the pressure was too heavy. The uncomfortable realization that sometimes people fall in love not with you, but with the version of you they've consumed online. He learned to step back before he was pushed. That withdrawal wasn't a disappearance. It was survival. He was still creating, still performing, still delivering songs that felt like open diaries. But behind the scenes, he tightened the circle. He became selective about who he trusted, who he allowed into the softer parts of himself. Fame had taught him that access is expensive. Psychologically, it changed him. When an artist becomes widely known, there's a strange reversal that happens. The world feels entitled to intimacy, while the artist becomes increasingly protective. The bigger the spotlight, the smaller the safe space feels. So you build boundaries. You curate your words. You learn how to answer questions without answering them. He mastered that skill. In interviews, when asked about love, he would pivot gracefully. "I let the music speak," he'd say. And it wasn't a cliché, it was strategy. Because once you speak plainly about your heart, it stops being entirely yours. It becomes content. It becomes clickable. It becomes something people dissect on podcasts and in comment sections. So he chose the song over the statement. He chose the stage over the rebuttal. He chose silence over defense. There is strength in that kind of restraint, though it rarely looks heroic from the outside. To not respond when misrepresented. To not clarify when misunderstood. To allow people to believe half-truths rather than feed the machine with explanations. Some called him distant during that period. Others said he had changed. What they didn't see was the exhaustion behind the composure, the quiet recalibration, the internal question he kept asking himself, what is mine, and what belongs to the world? He began to draw lines more clearly. No public arguments, no emotional outbursts online, no subtle confirmations or denials disguised as cryptic posts. If something hurt, he wrote about it. If something ended, he processed it in private. If something felt fragile, he protected it by refusing to name it. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was discipline. And yet, silence has a cost. When you choose not to explain, people fill the gaps. They assume. They project. They assign motives that were never yours. Over time, even the strongest artist can begin to question whether staying quiet is empowering or isolating. There were moments, fleeting but real, when he considered speaking out. When the rumors crossed lines, when the speculation felt invasive. But each time he returned to the same conclusion. Responding would only fuel it. And he refused to let his personal life become a performance. So he endured. He endured the headlines that got it wrong. The timelines that didn't match reality. The assumptions about who he was when the microphone was off. He endured it by remembering why he started in the first place. not to be dissected, but to create. Looking back now, that period of retreat feels almost necessary. It hardened him in some ways, softened him in others. It taught him what he could live without, and what he couldn't. It forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that fame amplifies both admiration and intrusion. And somewhere in that quiet resistance, in those years of choosing melody over argument, something inside him shifted. The wounds didn't disappear. They settled. They became part of his texture, part of the depth listeners hear when he sings about longing, which makes his recent openness feel even more significant, because this is not a man who reveals lightly, not someone who speaks impulsively about love. If he is saying something now, if he is allowing the world a glimpse, it is not because the pressure forced him. It's because, after years of protecting his heart with silence, he has decided that this time, the peace he found is stronger than the noise that once chased him. It didn't happen under flashing lights. There was no dramatic build-up, no teaser clip released the night before, no carefully scripted exclusive. The moment arrived the way certain truths do when they've finally stopped trembling inside you, quietly, almost shyly. It was during a small sit-down conversation, the kind that feels more like a late-night chat than a formal interview. No roaring audience, just a dim studio, a soft lamp casting warm light across his face, and a host who had learned not to push too hard. The questions had drifted from music to life, from inspiration to growth. And then, almost as an afterthought, came the inevitable one. "Are you in love?" There was a pause, not the defensive kind he used to give, not the strategic silence meant to redirect. This one felt different. He leaned back slightly, looked down at his hands for a second, and then up again. Not searching for an escape route, just choosing the right words. "I'm happy," he said first. Simple, unpolished, real. The host smiled, waiting. In the past, that would have been the cue for him to pivot, talk about gratitude, about focusing on music, about trusting God's timing. But he didn't pivot this time. He didn't shield himself with metaphor. "I'm happy," he repeated, and then added, almost gently, "and I think I deserve that." It wasn't loud, it wasn't defiant, it was steady. Later, when clips of the interview began circulating online, fans replayed that line over and over. Not because it was sensational, but because it felt honest in a way they hadn't heard before. He didn't name her. He didn't detail how they met. He didn't offer anecdotes designed to trend. He offered something more difficult than gossip. He offered vulnerability without spectacle. He went on carefully. "For a long time, I didn't know if I was ready to try again," he admitted. "Not because I don't believe in love, but because sometimes you get tired of explaining your heart to people who aren't living in it." That sentence carried weight. You could hear the years behind it, the misunderstandings, the guarded interviews, the strategic smiles. But there was no bitterness in his tone, no edge, just clarity. "I'm not hiding," he said softly. "I'm just protecting what feels right." And that was the difference. In the past, protection had looked like avoidance, like distance, like shutting doors before anyone could knock. Now, it looked more like calm confidence. He wasn't running from questions. He just wasn't feeding them either. There was relief. The kind that comes when you're not sure if you're going to get a raise. There was relief. The kind that comes when you stop negotiating with yourself about whether you're allowed to feel something good. For years, he had carried love like a fragile glass object, beautiful but easily shattered. Now, he spoke of it as something grounded, not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. "I'm learning not to overthink it," he said at one point, almost laughing at himself. I used to analyze everything, every feeling, every possibility. Now, I'm just present. That word, present, felt significant. Fame often pulls artists into extremes. Nostalgia for what was, anxiety about what's next. Being present requires trust. And trust, especially after public heartbreaks and private disappointments, is not something you reclaim overnight. He didn't romanticize the journey. He didn't pretend it had been smooth. I've been scared before, he admitted, of letting someone see me outside of the music. Because people fall in love with the artist. Not always the man. There it was again, the quiet honesty. But this time, fear didn't dominate the narrative. It was simply acknowledged and placed in its proper position. Not ignored. Not exaggerated. When asked if he worried about public opinion, he shook his head slightly. People will talk, he said. They always have. I can't build my life around that. That sentence might have sounded defensive years ago. Now it sounded settled. There was no tension behind it, just acceptance. He had moved past the phase of trying to control the narrative, past the urge to correct every misconception, past the instinct to retreat whenever attention felt intrusive. Instead, he seemed almost unbothered. Not careless, not reckless, just unafraid. There's a particular kind of maturity in that. The kind that doesn't need applause to validate happiness. The kind that understands love isn't proven through public display, but through quiet consistency. He didn't describe grand gestures or whirlwind romance. He described comfort, peace, laughter in ordinary moments. She makes my life softer, he said at one point, and then immediately smiled as if surprised by his own phrasing. I don't mean easier, just softer. That softness was visible in him, too, in the way he didn't tense up when her existence was acknowledged, in the way he didn't rush to move on from the topic. He allowed the conversation to breathe. It's striking when you compare it to the past. The same man who once chose silence over speculation is now choosing simplicity over secrecy. Not because he owes anyone an explanation, but because he no longer feels threatened by the idea of being seen. There's power in that, the power of someone who has been misunderstood and no longer feels the need to correct it. The power of someone who has tasted public scrutiny and decided it doesn't get to dictate private joy. The power of someone who, after years of guarding his heart like a vault, is finally opening the door. Not wide enough for the world to storm in, but enough to let light pass through. And perhaps the most shocking part isn't that he admitted he's in love. It's how calm he was when he did. No trembling voice, no dramatic pause for effect, no attempt to make it iconic. Just a man, sitting under warm studio lights, saying in the simplest way possible that he is happy, and that he believes he deserves to be. For someone who built a career on singing about love in all its complicated forms, this might be his most profound lyric yet. Not wrapped in melody, not layered with harmonies, just spoken plainly, without fear of headlines or hashtags. I'm happy, he had said. And this time he didn't sound like he was convincing anyone. He sounded like he finally believed it. He never said her name, and maybe that was the first sign that this was different. In an industry where relationships are often introduced like new singles, announced, branded, paraded, he chose restraint. Not secrecy in the old defensive sense, but reverence. As if saying too much would reduce something sacred into something consumable. She didn't arrive with fireworks. No dramatic meet-cute story tailored for headlines. No viral moment that forced the world to pay attention. If anything, she appeared quietly, the way steady things tend to do. Through conversation. Through time. Through presence. He once described it like this. She didn't come into my life trying to change it. She just fit. Fit. Not in the cinematic way of grand destiny. Not in the overwhelming rush that feels like a storm. But in the calm, almost surprising way a missing piece settles into place without forcing itself. Those close to him noticed her influence long before they knew anything about her. There was a shift in his rhythm. He wasn't as restless. He wasn't chasing distraction in the same way. He started protecting his downtime more intentionally, choosing evenings away from noise, leaving events earlier, laughing more freely in rooms that didn't require performance. She didn't need the spotlight, and perhaps that's exactly why he trusted her. In interviews, when he refers to her, his tone changes, not dramatically, but subtly. It softens. There's a steadiness in his voice, an absence of the old guarded tension. He doesn't speak in exaggerated praise. He doesn't overcompensate with romantic poetry. Instead, he says things that feel almost understated. "She listens," he once said, shrugging slightly, as if it were obvious. Not to respond, just to understand. It's a small detail, but revealing. For someone whose life has been filled with noise, applause, opinions, speculation, the gift of being understood without interruption is no small thing. He doesn't frame her as a savior. He doesn't suggest she healed him or completed him. That kind of language belongs to younger love, to the intensity of wanting someone to rescue you from yourself. This feels different. This feels like partnership. "She challenges me," he admitted in one conversation, "but not in a way that makes me feel small, in a way that makes me think." There's gratitude in the way he speaks about her. Not the flashy kind meant to impress an audience. The quiet gratitude of a man who has learned what doesn't work and recognizes what does. He has known infatuation before. He has known attraction, chemistry, that dizzy rush that feels unstoppable until it isn't. But when he talks about her, there's no breathless urgency. No need to convince the world that this is epic. Instead, he talks about ordinary moments, cooking together, sitting in silence without it feeling awkward, walking without needing to document it. "She's not impressed by the stage," he once said, half smiling. "She's impressed when I'm present." That distinction matters. In the past, the stage was inseparable from him. The artist and the man blurred into one image. But she sees the separation. She knows when he's exhausted, when he's doubting himself, when the pressure builds quietly behind his eyes. And she doesn't respond with awe. She responds with steadiness. This isn't the love of a young man trying to prove something. It isn't loud, impulsive, fueled by adrenaline. It's measured, considered, chosen. There's a certain humility in how he describes it. "I don't need to show it off," he said. "If it's real, it doesn't need witnesses." That line alone tells you how far he's come. Once, love in his life had to withstand commentary, had to survive public interpretation. Now, it exists outside that arena, protected not by secrecy, but by maturity. He speaks about her as someone who values simplicity, someone who doesn't equate visibility with importance, someone who understands that intimacy thrives in quiet spaces. And perhaps most striking of all, he doesn't sound afraid. Not afraid of losing her, not afraid of being judged, not afraid of loving fully. That fear used to linger in his words, even when unspoken. The cautious phrasing, the strategic pauses. Now, there's confidence. Not in the outcome, but in the choice. He has chosen her. Not because she dazzles the crowd, not because she elevates his image, but because she brings him peace. Peace isn't dramatic. It doesn't trend. It doesn't scream for attention. But for a man who has lived under scrutiny, peace might be the rarest luxury of all. "She makes my world quieter," he said once, and I didn't realize how loud it had been. That admission feels bigger than any public declaration of love. It acknowledges the chaos he once carried, the internal noise, the pressure. And it recognizes the value of someone who doesn't add to it, but gently reduces it. This is not a love story built on spectacle. It's built on consistency, on trust earned slowly, on conversations that stretch into the night without needing resolution, on mutual respect. He doesn't claim forever. He doesn't promise perfection. He simply acknowledges the present. And in that acknowledgement, there's something deeply adult. Because this is not the love of a man chasing validation. This is the love of a man who has known disappointment and chosen to try again anyway, who understands that happiness is not owed to him, but allowed, who no longer confuses intensity with depth. When he says he's happy now, you hear it differently knowing this context, knowing that she didn't enter his life as a headline, but as a quiet answer to questions he had stopped asking out loud. She is not the spotlight. She is the space outside of it. And for the first time in a long time, that seems to be exactly where he wants to be. The reaction was almost immediate, not explosive, not scandal-driven, just loud in its own way. For years, fans had watched him through a protective lens. They analyzed the sadness in his lyrics. They debated the weight behind certain performances. When he stepped back from the spotlight during difficult stretches, speculation turned into concern. Was he okay? Was he overwhelmed? Was the silence a sign of something heavier? There had been a time when his absence felt unsettling to the people who loved his music. Concert cancellations sparked anxiety. Fewer public appearances led to threads dissecting his well-being. Listeners who had grown up with his songs felt personally invested, as though his emotional state was tied to their own. And in a strange way it was. His music had been the soundtrack to their heartbreaks, their first loves, their private recoveries. They had leaned on his vulnerability. They had found comfort in his ache. So when he retreated into quiet, it felt like losing a voice that once guided them. That's why his recent admission didn't trigger gossip as much as relief. Social media shifted almost overnight. The tone changed. Instead of dissecting cryptic posts for hidden pain, fans began sharing old clips with captions like, "He deserves this." Comments filled with words that sounded less like curiosity and more like blessing. We prayed for his peace. Finally, he looks at ease. He gave us songs when we were broken. Now it's his turn to be happy. There's something powerful about that shift, from concern to celebration. It suggests that the audience wasn't simply craving drama. They were craving reassurance. They wanted to know that the man whose voice carried their sadness wasn't drowning in his own. Of course, not everyone responded with pure grace. There were questions. There always are. Who is she? How long has this been happening? Why keep it quiet until now? A few fans felt left out, as if the intimacy of his music entitled them to more transparency in return. But those voices were softer than expected. The overwhelming reaction was warmth. And that says something. Navigate scrutiny before. They had seen navigate scrutiny before. They had seen what overexposure could do. So when he chose to reveal just enough, without surrendering everything, they respected it. It's a complicated dynamic, this relationship between artist and audience. People fall in love with the version of him they meet through headphones, the tenderness in his falsetto, the honesty in his lyrics. They build an emotional connection that feels real, even if it's one-sided. And sometimes, that connection becomes possessive without anyone meaning for it to. When he sings about heartbreak, listeners feel close to him. When he sings about longing, they project their own stories onto his. Over time, it creates an illusion of shared intimacy. So when he finds happiness outside of their imagination, it can feel almost disorienting. But maturity changes audiences too. Many of his longtime fans have grown alongside him. They have loved, lost, healed, and tried again. They recognize the quiet shift in his voice now. They hear the difference between pain-driven art and peace-rooted expression, and they respond accordingly. There's an unspoken understanding in the way they speak about him these days. Less obsession, more protection, less entitlement, more empathy. It's as if they've realized something simple but profound. The man who gave them songs about love deserves to experience it beyond metaphor. Public figures often face an invisible burden. The more people admire them, the less room they seem to have for ordinary humanity. Fans sometimes love artists so fiercely that they forget those artists need the same basic things everyone else does: companionship, intimacy, privacy. They forget that the voice on stage goes home alone sometimes. That applause fades. That success doesn't cancel loneliness. And so when he says, calmly, that he is happy now, that he believes he deserves happiness, it feels like a correction. A gentle reminder that behind the persona is a man navigating life in real time. The relief from his supporters isn't just about romance. It's about stability. It's about seeing someone they've worried about look grounded again, look unhurried, look at peace. There's something deeply human in that response, because public love can easily become transactional. We support you. You entertain us. But in moments like this, it becomes something closer to mutual care. They gave him loyalty. He gave them honesty. Not complete exposure, not performative confession, just enough truth to reassure them. And in return, many have chosen to step back, to let him have what he has found. It's rare, this kind of collective exhale. Rare to see fans move from anxiety to acceptance without demanding more. Rare to witness admiration transform into quiet blessing. But perhaps that's what happens when an artist has consistently treated his audience with sincerity. He never sensationalized his pain for attention. He never weaponized heartbreak to manipulate sympathy. So when he speaks now, it feels earned. The public reaction, in its own way, reflects growth on both sides. He has matured into a man unafraid to claim joy. They have matured into supporters capable of celebrating it without ownership. And somewhere in that balance, between spotlight and solitude, between admiration and autonomy, there's a fragile but hopeful understanding. That loving an artist does not mean possessing them. That caring about someone's well-being includes allowing them private happiness. That sometimes the greatest show of support is not asking for details, but simply saying, "We're glad you're okay." And for a man who once carried the weight of unspoken questions, that quiet chorus of goodwill might matter more than any chart position or sold-out venue ever could. Love, when it comes the second or third time around, does not knock the same way. It doesn't arrive breathless. It doesn't demand dramatic declarations or reckless promises whispered at midnight. It moves differently. Slower, quieter, almost cautious, as if it too has learned what happens when expectations outrun reality. You can hear that understanding in him now. There was a time when love felt like a crescendo in his music, rising fast, swelling with intensity, daring the world to doubt it. Those were the seasons of fire, of urgency, when affection felt urgent and every emotion had to be proven, when the future was imagined in sweeping strokes, bold and certain. But experience changes the tone. Loss leaves a kind of imprint, not always visible, but permanent. Disappointment teaches you the weight of words. Promises, once spoken too freely, begin to feel sacred. You become careful with them, not because you believe less in love, but because you respect it more. And that's where he stands now. This isn't the love of a young man eager to declare forever before understanding what forever requires. It's the love of someone who has watched things fall apart, who has seen how fragile connection can be under pressure, who has felt the exhaustion of trying to hold something together alone. When he speaks about love today, there is no urgency to convince anyone. No need to prove that this is epic or extraordinary. Instead, he talks about presence. Being there, he once said simply, that's it. Being there when the spotlight fades. Being there when the mood is heavy. Being there when nothing remarkable is happening at all. That kind of love is not cinematic. It doesn't trend. It doesn't generate headlines. But it sustains. There's a philosophical depth in understanding that companionship often matters more than intensity. That shared silence can be more intimate than dramatic confession. That maturity means accepting imperfections, not trying to erase them. Love after loss carries humility. You stop trying to mold it into an ideal. You stop expecting it to erase old wounds. You stop chasing the thrill of being overwhelmed. Instead, you look for steadiness, for safety, for mutual choice. He no longer talks about love as something that completes him. That language belongs to an earlier chapter. Now, it sounds more like this. Two people walking side by side, aware of their scars, aware of their strengths, choosing each other daily without spectacle. There's something deeply grown about that. Because when you've experienced heartbreak, you understand what it costs to rebuild. You understand that love is not just about attraction or chemistry. It's about resilience. It's about patience on difficult days. It's about communication when silence feels easier. It's also about letting go of the illusion that happiness must arrive at a certain age. We are taught, subtly, that love belongs to youth, that the most powerful romances happen when we are young and fearless. But reality contradicts that myth. Sometimes the deepest love arrives later, after ego has softened, after expectations have been recalibrated, after we've learned to sit with ourselves. He embodies that shift. There's no rush in his voice when he speaks now. No anxious excitement, just clarity. A man who has stopped chasing the idea of love and started living its practice. Peace matters more to me than passion, he admitted once, almost as if confessing something controversial. But it isn't controversial. It's evolved. Passion is powerful, yes, but peace is sustaining. And when you've known chaos, both public and private, you begin to recognize the value of calm. Mature love does not demand constant proof. It does not require public validation. It thrives in consistency, in small rituals, in shared understanding that doesn't need explanation. There are fewer grand promises now. No sweeping vows about always or never. Those absolutes lose their shine after you've seen how life can shift without warning. Instead, there is something quieter. Intention. I choose this, he implies more than he declares. Choice, repeated daily, becomes stronger than promise shouted once. And perhaps the most profound realization in all of this is that happiness is rarely about timing in the way we imagine. It doesn't necessarily come when we are at our peak, young, famous, unscarred. Sometimes it arrives when we are ready to receive it without fear, when we no longer confuse attention with affection, when we no longer measure love by intensity alone, when we are prepared to offer it without losing ourselves. He seems ready now. Ready not because he has everything figured out, but because he has accepted that love is not about perfection. It's about willingness. Willingness to be seen. Willingness to trust. Willingness to risk disappointment again, knowing you survived it once. That is the quiet bravery of adulthood. Not the loud courage of declarations, but the steady courage of showing up. And maybe that's the deeper message behind his recent openness. Not simply that he has found someone new, but that he has found a version of himself capable of loving differently, more patiently, more honestly, less dramatically. There's something almost reassuring in that evolution. It challenges the idea that our best chances at happiness are behind us. It suggests that sometimes love waits, not for youth, not for fame, not for perfect circumstances, but for readiness, for alignment, for maturity. And in that sense, his story becomes less about celebrity romance and more about human timing. Happiness does not necessarily arrive when we are youngest. It arrives when we are most prepared to protect it without fear, when we understand that love is not a performance, it is a practice. And practice, after all, is something he knows very well. No declarations about weddings. No carefully timed announcement about the next step. No promises offered to satisfy curiosity. He hasn't said he'll go public in a grander way. He hasn't hinted at rings or ceremonies or timelines. He hasn't tried to convince anyone that this is forever. And maybe that restraint is the most telling detail of all. Because once you've lived long enough under scrutiny, you understand that the future doesn't need witnesses. It needs patience. So instead of projecting years ahead, he stays here, in the present tense. There's a different kind of strength in that choice. Not mapping out destiny for the cameras. Not transforming something private into a spectacle just to prove its seriousness. He doesn't need to perform permanence. He doesn't need to dramatize commitment. He simply allows what is to be. And that's where the story pauses. Not with a headline, not with a milestone, but with an image. It's evening. The kind of evening that feels unremarkable to everyone except the person living inside it. The house is quiet. Not lonely. Quiet. The air carries that soft stillness that comes after a long day when nothing urgent is left to chase. He sits beside the piano. Not on stage, not under lights. No audience waiting for the first note. Just a man and an instrument that has known his sadness, his doubts, his unanswered questions. His fingers rest lightly on the keys. There was a time when this was where he poured out confusion, when melodies were stitched together from unresolved ache, when chords carried weight he couldn't articulate in conversation. The piano became translator for emotions he refused to explain publicly. Tonight feels different. He plays softly, not searching for a hit, not chasing perfection, just exploring a sound that feels lighter. There is no dramatic minor progression, no heavy chorus waiting to break. The notes are steady, almost playful, as if even the music has exhaled. At some point, he stops. Not because the song is finished, just because he doesn't need to continue. He leans back slightly. The room holds the echo of the last chord. And in that echo, there is something unfamiliar. A smile. Small, unforced, the kind that appears when a memory surfaces without pain attached to it. He doesn't sing about heartbreak. He doesn't rehearse old lines about longing. Instead, he murmurs a name under his breath. Not loudly, not for anyone else to hear, just enough for himself. There's no need to record it. No need to document the moment. It belongs entirely to him. And perhaps that is the quiet triumph. For years, love in his life existed either as rumor or as metaphor. It was dissected, interpreted, questioned. Now, it exists in simplicity, in the unremarkable beauty of being understood, in the absence of fear when speaking about happiness. He does not know what tomorrow holds. He does not claim certainty about duration. He does not promise the world a fairy tale ending. He simply sits there, in the soft glow of evening, no longer haunted by the need to explain himself. The piano waits. The house is still, and somewhere beyond the frame of that quiet room, life continues. Unannounced, unfiltered, unhurried. He doesn't rush to post about it. He doesn't reach for his phone. He doesn't rehearse how to describe this feeling in a way that will trend. He just lets it be enough. That's the difference now. The absence of urgency. The absence of fear, the absence of the old reflex to protect himself by saying nothing at all. Because silence, once defensive, has become peaceful. And maybe that's why this image lingers longer than any public confession could. A man who once sang about love as something fragile, now touching the keys without trembling. A man who once guarded his heart like a secret, now smiling at the thought of someone who knows it fully. No vows spoken, no future mapped, just this moment. A quiet evening, a piano, a name that makes him soften instead of hesitate. And somewhere in that softness lies something more profound than spectacle. Because perhaps the most beautiful thing in life is not simply finding someone to love, but finding someone who makes you brave enough to believe in love again.